The night I planned to announce my pregnancy became the moment an entire room viewed me as a traitor. A stranger crashed our first anniversary party, loudly claiming my unborn child as his own. Yet, what truly silenced the Whitmore family wasn't the vile accusation. It was my husband's reaction. He didn't explode. Instead, he calmly locked every exit, stared down his relatives, and launched a brutal counterattack that ensured no one slept that night. My name is Avery Harper. I am 31 years old, and if you had told the girl who grew up in a cramped, drafty row house in the working-class neighborhoods of Providence, Rhode Island, that she would one day be the guest of honor in a Newport mansion, she would have laughed in your face. I am a project analyst at Crestmere Urban Systems, a woman used to sprawling city spreadsheets, hard hats, and earning every single dollar that has ever sat in my modest bank account. Yet, as I stood beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Whitmore estate, breathing in the scent of sea salt and $1,000 floral arrangements imported from halfway across the globe, I felt a suffocating mixture of profound gratitude and overwhelming alienation. This was the celebration of my first year of marriage, a milestone that felt both like a beautiful, improbable dream and a meticulously orchestrated test I was constantly failing. My husband is Nolan Whitmore. At 34, he is the eldest son and the golden heir to a dynasty that practically owns the entire coastline. The Whitmores are not just wealthy, they are old money, the kind of family that possesses a multi-billion-dollar empire of investment funds, sprawling coastal real estate, and a lineage they wear like invisible armor against the rest of the world. Nolan is the absolute anchor of their legacy, a man bred for high-stakes boardrooms and philanthropic galas. Yet somehow, against all odds and expectations, he had chosen me. The estate tonight was a masterclass in aggressive, unapologetic opulence. The grand ballroom was bathed in the warm, golden glow of 3 massive antique crystal chandeliers. Waiters in pristine white jackets glided silently across the imported Italian marble floors, carrying silver trays lined with flutes of vintage champagne and delicate caviar canapes. The air buzzed with the low, cultivated murmur of the elite senators, hedge fund managers, and old money socialites draped in custom silk gowns that cost more than my entire college tuition. I wore a tailored emerald gown, beautiful but intentionally modest compared to the diamonds glittering relentlessly around me. I tried my hardest to maintain a serene smile, a fabricated mask of belonging. Even as the judging eyes of his extended family swept over my figure, I knew the truth, and so did they. I was an outsider. I had not been born for this cutthroat world, and my continued presence here was an uncomfortable, glaring disruption to their perfectly curated bloodline. Beneath the emerald silk, a secret fluttered nervously in my stomach, making the champagne flute in my hand feel like a dangerous, forbidden prop. I was pregnant, just shy of 13 weeks. Nolan and I had planned this evening down to the exact minute. We were going to wait until the final hour of the reception, long after the heavy main course had been cleared and the older, more conservative guests began to slowly depart, to quietly pull his immediate family aside and share the news. It was supposed to be our ultimate triumph, a tiny, fragile new life that would cement my place not just as Nolan's wife, but as the undeniable mother of the next Whitmore generation. I kept sipping sparkling water masquerading as clear gin, bracing myself against the subtle, relentless psychological warfare waged by my mother-in-law. Vivian Whitmore was a chilling vision in pale silver silk, her posture as rigid and flawless as her pedigree. She approached me multiple times throughout the evening with a perfectly painted smile that never quite reached her pale, icy eyes. Her manners were impeccably polite on the surface, yet every single sentence she delivered was a perfectly wrapped, razor-sharp insult. She would loudly compliment my dress, then gently note that it was a very brave, unconventional color choice for someone with my ordinary complexion. She would ask about my career at Crestmere Urban Systems, only to smoothly pivot to how impossibly demanding it must be for a woman of my specific, humble background to keep up with the grand social obligations of a Whitmore wife. Her words were always soft, coated in faux maternal concern, but the message was a steady, rhythmic, inescapable drumbeat telling me that I did not belong in her house. If it were not for Nolan, the crushing weight of their collective disapproval would have suffocated me months ago. Throughout the long, exhausting evening, he was my absolute shield. Whenever a conversation veered too close to my family's lack of social standing or my public school education, he materialized instantly at my side. I felt the warm, reassuring weight of his hand resting perfectly on the small of my back, a silent, powerful promise that I was not fighting this battle alone. He would lean down, his warm breath brushing the curve of my neck, and softly ask if I was too tired, if my feet were hurting in my heels, or if I needed him to steal me away to the gardens for a few minutes of quiet air. His dark eyes held a fierce, unwavering devotion that made the surrounding hostility fade into meaningless background noise. Looking at him, dressed immaculately in a bespoke black tuxedo, I let myself believe that love could be enough to conquer a dynasty. I convinced myself that with his strong hands securely holding mine, I could weather the storm of the Whitmore matriarchy, the icy, unblinking glares, and the endless whispered judgments. He was my secure, safe harbor in a grand room full of sharks. But even the safest harbors have dark, unseen undercurrents, and tonight, the air inside the ballroom felt strangely electrified, heavy with a bizarre tension I could not quite identify or explain away. While I stood near the string quartet, forcing polite, hollow laughter at a tedious story told by one of Nolan's distant uncles, my anxious gaze drifted to the far, shadowed corner of the room. My sister-in-law, Greer, and Aunt Lenora were standing uncomfortably close together, their heads huddled in an intense, hushed conversation. Greer, usually the loud, obnoxious center of attention with her theatrical laughter and extravagant hand gestures, looked uncharacteristically rigid and pale. She kept repeatedly glancing down at her diamond-encrusted watch, her thin heel tapping a frantic, erratic rhythm against the polished marble floor. Lenora, a bitter woman whose aging face was perpetually set in a deep scowl of aristocratic superiority, held her crystal champagne glass so tightly I genuinely thought the fragile stem might snap in her grip. They were whispering furiously, their eyes occasionally darting toward the heavy grand entrance of the ballroom, then snapping back to study me with a look that was entirely devoid of their usual lazy condescension. It was not mockery shining in their eyes tonight. It was raw, burning anticipation. A cold, crawling sensation slowly mapped its way up my spine. It felt as though an invisible countdown had started in the very center of the room, and I was the absolute only person present who could not see the glowing numbers on the clock. I took a deep breath and desperately tried to shake the paranoid feeling off, logically attributing it to the surging pregnancy hormones and the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of performing the demanding role of the perfect, unbothered high society wife for 3 solid hours. Then, the beautiful classical music swelled to a close, and the low hum of wealthy conversation faded into a respectful, expectant silence. Nolan stepped confidently onto the small raised dais at the front of the magnificent room, gently tapping a silver dessert spoon against the rim of his crystal water glass. The sharp, clear sound rang out, instantly commanding the attention of every single person present. He looked out over the vast sea of faces, his handsome expression radiating a quiet, powerful, and genuine joy. And then, his dark eyes deliberately searched the crowd and found mine. He smiled, a genuine, heart-stopping smile that made my breath catch in my throat and the corners of my own mouth lift instantly. He raised his glass high above his head. He spoke with the smooth, captivating cadence of a man who owned the world but only cared about one thing in it, formally thanking the prestigious guests for gathering to celebrate our first remarkable year of marriage. He spoke passionately of love, of building unshakable foundations, and then, his voice dropped an octave, growing incredibly intimate and thick with unhidden emotion. He raised his glass a tiny fraction higher and proposed a toast to family, to the unwritten future, and to a beautiful, life-changing new beginning. My heart absolutely soared. The suffocating anxiety that had been mercilessly clawing at my chest all night completely evaporated, quickly replaced by a radiant, overwhelming warmth that spread from my stomach to my fingertips. The room, with all its intimidating wealth and judgment, suddenly felt perfect. The night, after all the stress, the planning, and the silent, exhausting battles, finally felt like it truly belonged to me. I took a deep, steadying breath, entirely ready to step forward into my bright new life as a mother. And then, with a violent, echoing crack that shattered the silence, the heavy double oak doors of the grand hall burst wide open. The heavy oak doors slammed against the walls with a violent, deafening thud that echoed sharply off the vaulted ceilings. The sudden noise was so jarring that a nearby waiter dropped a silver serving tray, the crystal glasses shattering against the marble floor in a cacophony of sharp, musical clinks. Through the gaping entrance strode a man who fundamentally did not belong in this meticulously curated space. He looked to be in his early 30s, dressed in a black suit that hung awkwardly off his shoulders, the fabric cheap and entirely devoid of the bespoke tailoring that defined every other man in the room. His tie was slightly askew, and his shoes lacked the mirror-like polish required for a Whitmore event. Yet, despite his glaringly out-of-place appearance, he carried himself with an infuriating, misplaced swagger. He marched straight down the center aisle, cutting a jagged, disruptive path through the sea of horrified aristocrats as though he owned the very ground he walked upon. He did not pause at the threshold. He did not look around in awe at the immense wealth on display. He stopped a mere 10 feet from the raised dais. He completely ignored the powerful politicians standing to his left, and he did not even acknowledge my husband, the host of the evening, standing just above him, his eyes locked entirely on me. It was a gaze dripping with a sickening, manufactured intimacy, a look that suggested a long history of shared secrets, hushed conversations, and tangled bedsheets. A violent, icy shudder ripped down my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. I searched his face frantically, analyzing the shape of his jaw, the set of his eyes, digging through every memory I possessed. Nothing. I had never seen this man before in my entire life. "My name is Dean Talbot," he announced. His voice was incredibly loud, raw and unpolished, echoing off the marble and bouncing against the massive chandeliers above. It lacked the refined, low-timbered cadence of the elite crowd. It was harsh, grating, and demanding. Nolan instantly lowered his crystal glass, his jaw tightening into a sharp, dangerous line. His protective instinct flared, his hand moving slightly as if preparing to signal the discreet security detail positioned around the perimeter. But before he could utter a single command, the stranger kept speaking. "I am profoundly sorry to interrupt such a beautiful, moving toast." Dean projected his voice, every syllable dripping with a thick, theatrical mockery of an apology. "But every single person in this magnificent room deserves to know the actual truth before raising a glass to a disgusting, calculated lie." The entire ballroom seemed to collectively stop breathing. The music had long ceased, and now, even the faint rustle of silk gowns and the subtle clinking of ice melting in glasses vanished. It was a vacuum of absolute, suffocating silence. Dean raised a hand, his sleeve pulling back to reveal a cheap leather watch, and pointed a long, accusing finger directly at the center of my chest. "The baby she is carrying right now. That child is mine." For 3 agonizing, endless seconds, the silence held. It was so heavy it felt like physical pressure against my eardrums. Then, the vacuum shattered completely. A massive, uncontrollable wave of sharp gasps, dropped silverware, and furious whispering erupted like a wildfire racing through dry brush. Hundreds of eyes swiveled simultaneously from the stranger in the cheap suit directly to me. I felt the immense, crushing weight of their collective stare. A heavy, burning judgment pressing down on my shoulders, stripping me bare in front of the most powerful people in the state. The stem of my champagne flute snapped in my numb fingers, the glass shattering and the liquid splashing across the toe of my velvet shoe. "What?" I choked out. My voice sounded incredibly thin, high-pitched, and frantic, lacking any of the sophisticated poise I had spent the last 12 months perfecting. Nolan, I swear to you, I have absolutely no idea who this person is. I have never met him in my entire life. Dean let out a dry, deeply patronizing chuckle. It was the exact kind of tired, exasperated laugh a frustrated partner gives during a bitter lover's quarrel. It was an Oscar-worthy performance of a man dealing with a hysterical, lying woman, reaching inside his poorly tailored jacket. He pulled out a thick manila folder. He aggressively flipped it open, holding up the contents high for the nearest guest to see. "She is going to deny it. Of course she is," Dean said, his voice now laced with a practiced, heavy sorrow, playing the ultimate victim. "She chose the billionaire over the real father, but I brought the medical records right here. Avery Harper, currently pregnant. The conception date perfectly matches the timeline of our affair." He waved crisp white sheets of paper in the air. Even from several feet away, my heart stopped as I recognized the official, distinctive blue logo of the Harborline Women's Center printed at the top of the pages. I could see my full legal name printed in bold, stark black ink. He was holding my private appointment schedules. He had my blood test results. He had ultrasound printouts that I had only just received. My vision blurred violently at the edges, a dizzying wave of vertigo washing over me. How in the world did a complete stranger get his hands on my most guarded medical secrets, who had given him access to my body on paper? "And if you all believe paper can be forged or bought," Dean continued relentlessly, pulling a large smartphone from his trouser pocket, "pictures absolutely do not lie." He swiped a thick thumb across the glowing screen and aggressively shoved the phone toward the closest group of older Whitmore aunts. I caught a horrifying, impossible glimpse of the bright display. It was an image of me, or rather, a flawless digital reconstruction of me, leaning intimately against Dean's shoulder outside a well-known boutique hotel downtown. A second swipe revealed another photo, this one showing us standing dangerously close together in the distinct parking lot of my exact maternity clinic. In that photo, his hand was resting possessively, lovingly, on the slight curve of my stomach. The lighting, the angles, the sheer visceral reality of the images struck me like a physical blow to the ribs. The woman in the photos was wearing my favorite camel coat, a coat I had worn to my last appointment. They were fake. They had to be a malicious fabrication, but to the untrained, eager eye, they looked flawlessly, devastatingly real. Panic clawed at my throat, thick and choking, completely paralyzing my vocal cords. I opened my mouth to scream, to violently tear the fraudulent folder from his hands, to demand someone immediately call the police and arrest this lunatic, but the words withered and died on my tongue. The grand golden room began to spin sickeningly. I was trapped in a nightmare, publicly stripped of my dignity and my truth. I desperately looked at the faces surrounding me, seeking any sign of doubt, any flicker of logic. Instead, I found exactly what I feared the most. Aunt Lenora was nodding slowly, a deeply vindicated, ugly smirk playing on her thin, painted lips. Greer covered her mouth with a manicured hand in a display of feigned, theatrical shock, but her cold eyes danced with vicious, unfiltered triumph. I heard a distant cousin mutter the word trash loud enough to carry over the murmurs. They did not need forensic analysis of the photos. They did not care about the bizarre, cinematic improbability of a scorned lover crashing an elite gala. They completely ignored the glaring logical gaps of why a supposedly heartbroken man would choose a public spectacle over a private legal battle. The evidence was flimsy, highly sensationalized garbage, but in that glorious, terrible moment, the actual truth was completely, entirely irrelevant to them. The Whitmore family had spent the last 365 days silently praying for a valid reason to excise me from their pristine, gold-plated family tree. They despised my background, my independence, and my presence. They had been waiting for me to slip, to prove that I was exactly the manipulative gold digger they had always accused me of being behind closed doors. And tonight, a nameless stranger in a cheap suit had just gleefully handed them the scalpel to cut me out forever. The initial shockwave receded, leaving behind a toxic, suffocating atmosphere. Vivian was the first to strike. The mask of polite, icy tolerance she had worn for 365 days dissolved completely. She stepped forward, her silver gown shimmering like metallic armor, her voice vibrating with a shrill, venomous certainty that cut effortlessly through the lingering murmurs of the crowd. "I knew it," she spat, her perfectly manicured finger pointing squarely at my chest. "I had a visceral, undeniable feeling from the very first moment you set foot in our home. I told everyone you would eventually drag this entire family down into the absolute mud, and here we are. A complete, unmitigated humiliation orchestrated by a woman who could never wash the dirt of her upbringing off her hands." "Mother, stop," Nolan commanded, his tone dropping into a dangerously low, warning register. But Charles Whitmore, the patriarch, moved seamlessly to his wife's side, reinforcing her attack. Charles never yelled. He did not need to raise his voice to destroy a person. He wielded his power with a quiet, devastating precision. His face was a mask of carved granite, his eyes entirely dead as they swept over me. He did not address me directly. He spoke only to his son, his voice colder than a winter storm off the Atlantic coast. "You will handle this, Nolan," Charles ordered, his words clipped and unforgiving. "You will deal with this grotesque situation immediately, right here, in front of our guests. We do not sweep public disgraces under the rug, and we certainly do not coddle deceit. Excise the rot before it spreads to the foundation of this family." Greer, smelling blood in the water, eagerly stepped into the fray. She practically vibrated with malicious joy, ensuring her high theatrical voice carried effortlessly to the farthest corners of the room. "Well, it certainly makes perfect sense now, does it not? Think about it, Nolan. She has been incredibly secretive about all her prenatal appointments. Every single time I asked to tag along or even casually inquired about the ultrasound dates, she completely shut me out. She guarded that calendar like a state secret. Now we all know exactly why she was hiding those clinic visits. She was terrified we would run into her actual lover." Her words were a masterclass in weaponized hindsight. Suddenly, my perfectly normal desire for privacy, my simple, natural wish to keep the early, fragile stages of my pregnancy between just my husband and me, was twisted into indisputable, damning proof of infidelity. I had politely declined Greer's intrusive offers because she stressed me out. Yet here she was, spinning my boundaries into a narrative of profound betrayal. The physical reaction of the room was perhaps the most agonizing part of the ordeal. Only an hour ago, these same politicians, wealthy socialites, and distant cousins had been warmly pressing their cheeks against mine, wrapping their arms around my shoulders, and whispering bright, empty congratulations on our anniversary. Now, I watched in absolute horror as they instinctively took unified, synchronized steps backward. The crowd literally parted, leaving me standing entirely alone in a wide, isolated circle of polished marble. They looked at me as though I were carrying a highly contagious disease, subtly drawing their expensive garments closer to their bodies to avoid contamination. In the span of a few minutes, I had been instantly demoted from the privileged, celebrated wife of the heir to a filthy, opportunistic fraud. Seeing the tide turn entirely in his favor, Dean leaned heavily into his role. He let out a ragged, dramatic sigh, dragging a rough hand over his face as if burdened by immense, unbearable emotional agony. "I kept my mouth shut for several months," he declared, his voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. "I really did try. I tried to walk away. I told myself to let her have her fancy billionaire marriage and her huge mansion by the sea. I told myself she was making a choice for financial stability. But when I saw those clinic schedules, when I realized she was actually going to pass my own flesh and blood off as a Whitmore heir, it broke me. I cannot stand by and let my own child grow up living under another man's name. A man who has absolutely zero biological claim to my baby. The sheer audacity of his performance made my stomach violently heave. He was expertly painting himself as the tragic, noble father fighting against a corrupt, wealthy establishment and a heartless, social-climbing woman. It was exactly the kind of scandalous, poverty-stricken narrative the Whitmores were utterly desperate to swallow regarding me. From the back of the silent, observing crowd, the harsh, authoritative voice of Uncle Richard, the family's lead corporate attorney, sliced through the tension. "Nolan, you need to invoke the morality clause in the prenuptial agreement tonight," Richard advised loudly, treating the destruction of my life and my marriage like a casual boardroom acquisition. "Given the extreme severity of this public breach of fidelity, you have full legal grounds to void the standard spousal support tiers. Cut her off completely. Do not let her walk away with a single cent of our family trust. She engineered this pregnancy to secure a permanent payout, and this man just handed us the key to lock her out of the vault." My breath grew shallow, scraping painfully against my dry throat. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the suggestion paralyzed me. They were already dividing my assets, terminating my marriage, and casting me out onto the street before I had even been allowed a single, fair chance to defend myself against a madman. I had spent the last 12 months bending over backwards, silencing my own voice, taking intensive etiquette classes, and swallowing my working-class pride just to fit into their immaculate, gold-plated mold. Yet, it took less than 5 minutes for a stranger with cheap shoes and a forged document to unravel all of it. They did not require concrete proof. They only required an excuse. But as the initial blinding wave of panic began to subside, a cold, sharp realization pierced through the fog of terror in my mind. The blind fear morphed slowly into something far more clinical and terrifying. I forced my shaking eyes to study Dean again, looking past his cheap suit and his fake tears. This was not a random shakedown. A desperate, crazy stalker might fabricate an affair, but they would not possess the exact dates of my appointments. They would not have flawlessly doctored ultrasound scans matching my precise gestational age down to the exact day. Furthermore, a random con artist would not know exactly when to time this interruption. He had walked in precisely as Nolan raised his glass to announce the pregnancy to the extended family. He knew the exact layout of the room, marching straight to the front without a single moment of hesitation or confusion. He understood the complex, fragile dynamics of the Whitmore family, knowing exactly what buttons to push to make them turn on me instantly. To manipulate medical records required bypassing highly sophisticated, dual authentication hospital security systems. To bypass the estate's heavy, gated security on the night of a major, exclusive event required inside clearance. He did not sneak in over the high stone walls. Someone had willingly opened the door for him. Someone who had intimate, unfettered access to our private schedules, our security details, and my highly protected medical portal had orchestrated this. This man was simply a hired gun, a cheap, theatrical missile launched by an unseen enemy who desperately needed to ensure my unborn child was delegitimized before it ever took its first breath. I was not just a victim of a crazy ex-lover. I was the target of a highly calculated corporate and familial assassination. The grand ballroom was completely still, the air thick with anticipation and bloodlust. Every single guest, from Vivian with her triumphant, glowing glare to Charles with his icy, aristocratic disdain, was collectively holding their breath. They had drawn the battle lines, effectively cornering the prey. I slowly turned my head, my neck stiff with an overwhelming dread, and looked at my husband. The entire ballroom immediately followed my gaze. Hundreds of eyes locked simultaneously onto Nolan Whitmore, the golden boy, the ruthless businessman, the man whose pride and lineage had just been publicly, viciously dragged through the dirt by a stranger. They were waiting for the inevitable, explosive reaction. They expected him to hurl his crystal glass against the wall, to scream at me in a fit of betrayed rage, to violently demand a paternity test, or to summon the armed guards to physically drag me out of his ancestral home. They were waiting for him to destroy me, exactly as they had always wanted him to do. I stared up at his handsome face, my heart hammering a frantic, agonizing rhythm against my ribs. In that suspended, agonizing second, everything hung entirely in the balance. My life, my marriage, my reputation, and the actual truth rested entirely on what the man standing beside me chose to do next. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for the explosive, primal reaction of a deeply betrayed man. They expected my husband to lunge across the polished marble, to grab the intruder by his cheap lapels, or to turn his wrath upon me. But Nolan did none of those things. He did not clench his fists. He did not shout. Instead, his posture relaxed into something utterly terrifying. The subtle, diplomatic warmth he had radiated all evening vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating stillness of a corporate predator who had just spotted a fatal flaw in an opponent's strategy. He handed his delicate crystal water glass to a paralyzed waiter standing nearby. He descended the short stairs of the dais with measured, unhurried steps. The crowd instinctively parted for him, practically stumbling over their own expensive hemlines to get out of his path. He bypassed the intruder entirely, not even granting the man a fleeting glance, and walked directly toward the small bandstand where the hired master of ceremonies stood frozen in shock. Nolan reached out and calmly took the silver microphone from the man's trembling hand. "Kill the ambient audio feeds," Nolan instructed the sound engineer in a flat, authoritative tone. The low hum of the amplifiers died instantly, plunging the massive space into a stark, unforgiving acoustic void. Nolan turned on his heel to face the perimeter of the room. He did not look at his parents. He looked straight at the towering figure of Marcus, the head of the estate's private security firm, who was already speaking urgently into a wrist microphone. "Marcus," Nolan's voice resonated through the speakers, devoid of any panic. "Lock the main wrought iron gates immediately. Secure all secondary and service exits. Confiscate the physical guest registry from the front vestibule and lock down the digital check-in logs. I want a full, uncorrupted backup of every single surveillance camera on this property, starting from 4 hours prior to this exact moment, and I am issuing a strict quarantine order. No one, absolutely not a single person, is permitted to leave this estate for the next 30 minutes. A sharp, collective gasp rippled through the sea of socialites and politicians. This was an unprecedented violation of high society protocol. These were senators, hedge fund billionaires, and old money matriarchs who were accustomed to dictating the rules, not following them. To lock them inside a mansion and treat them as potential persons of interest was a glaring insult. They expected the soft, philanthropic heir to fold under public pressure, to hastily usher the scandal out of sight to protect the family brand. Instead, he was aggressively transforming his own anniversary gala into an active, locked-down interrogation room. Only then did Nolan turn his attention away from the security team. He walked slowly back to the center of the floor, stepping right past the man claiming to be the father of my child, and stopped directly in front of me. My heart battered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked up into his dark eyes, searching frantically for a flicker of doubt, a shadow of suspicion, or the horrible realization that he had made a mistake marrying me. I found nothing but a fierce, impenetrable calm. He did not look at the forged medical documents scattered on the floor. He did not ask me if the accusations were true. He simply reached out, his warm fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair away from my pale cheek. "Avery," he said softly, speaking entirely into the microphone so the entire room could hear the absolute intimacy in his voice. "During our very first date, when that sudden thunderstorm broke over the harbor and we had to run for cover, what was the exact color of the cheap umbrella I bought from the street vendor?" The sheer absurdity of the question caught the entire audience off guard. It was an incredibly mundane, fiercely private detail buried deeply in our shared history, something no private investigator or hired actor could ever possibly uncover. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. "It was neon yellow," I answered, my voice surprisingly steady and clear in the deadened room. "And it had a broken metal spoke on the left side that kept aggressively snagging the shoulder of your wool coat. A tiny, Almost imperceptible smile touched the very corners of his mouth. It was a silent, powerful confirmation. He had never needed proof of my innocence. He only needed to demonstrate our unbreakable alignment to the vultures circling us. Nolan slowly turned his back to me, using his own body as a physical shield between me and the rest of the room. He finally locked eyes with the man in the cheap suit. "You walked into the wrong room," Nolan stated, his voice amplified, echoing like a judge reading a final sentence. "You memorized the wrong fabricated details. You targeted the absolute wrong woman, and you tried to run a pathetic, amateur con on the wrong family." Dean visibly faltered. The arrogant, theatrical swagger he had carried through the doors began to rapidly dissolve. He opened his mouth, desperately trying to point at the falsified ultrasound scans again, but Nolan cut him off with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. "I am not speaking to you anymore," Nolan said coldly, his gaze shifting up and over the intruder, sweeping deliberately across the pale, rigid faces of his own blood relatives. Aunt Lenora suddenly looked incredibly interested in the floor. Greer shifted her weight nervously from foot to foot. "I am speaking directly to whoever handed him the script," Nolan announced, his voice carrying a lethal, uncompromising weight. "Someone standing in this very room provided high-level security clearance to bypass my gates. Someone accessed heavily encrypted, private medical schedules. This was not a random shakedown. This was a highly orchestrated, internal strike." The silence in the grand hall was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of predators, suddenly realizing they were the ones being hunted. "So, I am making a solemn promise to every single person standing here tonight," Nolan continued, his tone dropping an octave, ringing with absolute finality. "When my investigation team uncovers exactly who funded this theatrical stunt, the consequences will not be limited to a quiet social exile. The architect of this attack will be permanently stripped of their honor, but more importantly, they will be legally and permanently severed from this empire. You will lose every trust fund dividend, every board seat, and every single ounce of voting power. You will never have the right to touch a single dime of Whitmore assets ever again." The threat was a nuclear strike. In this family, threatening social standing was a minor insult, but threatening the money was an act of total war. "Nolan, that is entirely enough." Vivian's voice cracked like a sharp whip, shattering the tension. She pushed her way violently to the front of the crowd, her face flushed with a furious, ugly indignation. She could not fathom her son choosing an outsider over the sacred family treasury. "Do not overreact and humiliate us further just to protect a lying girl. The evidence is right there in his hands. Stop this theatrical nonsense and handle her quietly." For the first time in his 34 years of life, Nolan did not defer to the matriarch. "Mother," he snapped, the single word sharp enough to draw blood. He cut her off loudly, publicly, right in the middle of her own grand ballroom. "You will not speak another derogatory word about my wife tonight. You will not disrespect the mother of my child in this house. If you cannot abide by that simple rule, you are more than welcome to have Marcus escort you off your own property." Vivian staggered backward a half step, her mouth dropping open in genuine, unadulterated shock. No one ever spoke to Vivian Whitmore like that. Certainly not her obedient, golden son. The public rebuke was so profound, so absolute, that it cemented a terrifying new reality for the entire dynasty. Nolan slowly lowered the microphone, letting it drop to the thick carpet with a soft thud. He turned around and walked back to my side. He did not grab my arm to rush me out a side door to hide our shame. He did not ask me to retreat to the safety of a private study. Instead, he reached out and firmly intertwined his fingers with mine. He adjusted his stance, pulling me slightly forward so I stood shoulder to shoulder with him. He anchored me there in the glaring, unforgiving light, facing the hundreds of people who had eagerly anticipated my downfall. It was a silent, indestructible declaration. He was not just defending me, he was officially drawing the battle lines. He held my hand tightly, letting the entire room know that I was not being pushed out of my position as his wife. and that the war for our future had only just begun. We did not return to our sweeping, glass-walled apartment in the city. As the heavy iron gates of the estate closed behind us, cutting off the blinding flashes of the security team's flashlights, Nolan steered his car in the opposite direction of our normal lives. He drove us nearly 2 hours south, navigating the winding, unlit coastal roads until the smooth asphalt gave way to crushed gravel. We arrived at a small, weather-beaten beach house in Narragansett, a property that had belonged to his late maternal grandmother. It was a fiercely guarded secret, a place entirely disconnected from the sprawling Whitmore corporate mainframe. There were no smart home devices here, no integrated security cameras tied to the family network, and most importantly, no staff to report our movements back to his parents. The moment the deadbolt clicked shut, sealing us inside the drafty, salt-scented living room, the adrenaline that had kept me standing all evening finally evaporated. My knees buckled, and I sank onto the edge of a faded floral sofa, pulling my emerald silk gown tightly around my shivering shoulders. Nolan knelt on the worn hardwood floor in front of me. He took my icy, trembling hands in his warm grasp and pressed a long, fervent kiss to my knuckles. His eyes, usually so guarded and strategic, were entirely soft, swimming with a fierce, protective agony. He told me he loved me. He stated, with absolute, unwavering clarity, that he believed every single word I had said on that dais, and that the theatrical display in the ballroom had not planted even a microscopic seed of doubt in his mind. It was the ultimate reassurance, the exact validation my fragile heart had been silently screaming for during the public crucifixion. Yet, as his warm hands stroked my forearms, a strange, creeping chill began to snake its way up my spine. "My trust is absolute, Avery," Nolan murmured, his voice heavy with an exhaustion that seemed to reach his very bones. "But my trust is no longer enough to keep you safe. Whoever orchestrated this attack did not just pull a random name out of a hat. They have unrestricted, invisible access to your private medical portals. They know your schedule. They know your body." His words fundamentally altered the architecture of my fear. The terrifying prospect of losing my marriage vanished, instantly replaced by a far more insidious, violating terror. I was no longer a wife fearing her husband's rejection. I was a woman realizing she had been hunted in broad daylight. I pressed my hands against my stomach, my mind racing as it automatically began to compile and analyze the data of the past 3 months. I am a project analyst by trade. I look for patterns, and suddenly, a horrifying mosaic began to form behind my closed eyelids. Innocuous, easily dismissed moments mutated into glaring, terrifying red flags. I vividly remembered a bizarre phone call exactly 3 weeks prior. The caller identification displayed the main desk of the Harbor Line Women's Center. When I answered, expecting to confirm my upcoming blood work, there was only a dense, staticky silence followed by a sharp click. Just 5 days after that, a massive, expensive arrangement of pale pink peonies had been delivered directly to my desk at Crestmere Urban Systems. There was no card attached. I had naturally assumed it was a sweet, spontaneous gesture from Nolan, but when I called to thank him, he had sounded genuinely confused. The most damning puzzle piece of all fell into place as I recalled a tense family brunch 2 Sundays ago. Greer had cornered me near the Mimosa Bar and casually asked if Nolan would be accompanying me to my ultrasound on Thursday the 12th. I had frozen, wondering how my sister-in-law knew the exact date of a strictly confidential appointment, but she had quickly laughed it off, claiming she had merely guessed based on standard trimester timelines. I had been actively surveilled. My digital footprint, my phone records, my medical privacy, everything had been silently compromised. Invisible eyes had been tracking my every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sleep was a physical impossibility. I spent the dark hours staring at the peeling paint on the ceiling, trapped in a paralyzing loop of paranoia. When the gray, bruised light of dawn finally began to filter through the heavy canvas curtains around 6 in the morning, I found Nolan sitting at the scarred wooden kitchen table. His laptop cast a harsh, blue glow across his exhausted face. He did not attempt to close the screen or shield the display from me as I wrapped a thick woolen blanket around my shoulders and walked slowly toward him. The digital assassination had already begun. The local Newport Society blogs and elite gossip forums were completely saturated with anonymous, highly venomous posts. The narrative had been expertly, systematically seeded overnight. The posts did not mention the dramatic ballroom confrontation directly, but they viciously smeared my name, painting me as a ruthless, calculating woman from the working-class slums who had intentionally weaponized a pregnancy to trap the Whitmore heir. Reading the cruel, calculated words, a profound, agonizing realization struck me like a physical blow to the chest. This entire sickening performance was never just about humiliating me. It was never just a petty attempt to force a quick, messy divorce. It was a preemptive, tactical strike against an unborn target. They were deliberately destroying the moral legitimacy of my baby before my child even possessed the lungs to draw a first breath. If the baby was branded a bastard born of deceit in the eyes of high society, any future claims to the family legacy would be irrevocably tainted. I sank heavily into the wooden chair beside him, the wood creaking loudly in the silent kitchen. I felt incredibly small, clutching the blanket around my waist. "Why," I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of the realization. "Why go to these extreme psychopathic lengths? They already despise me. Why orchestrate an attack on a completely innocent child?" Nolan slowly pushed the laptop away, closing his eyes for a long, agonizing moment. When he opened them, they held a profound, heavy sorrow, the unique guilt of a man who realized his very existence had placed a target on the back of the woman he loved. "There is a structural reality to my family's wealth that I have kept from you," he began, his voice dropping into a low, grave register. "A massive, legal mechanism that I intentionally hid because I desperately wanted to shield you from the venomous politics of my lineage until after the baby arrived safely." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, clasping his hands together so tightly his knuckles turned white. "My grandfather designed the generational trusts with a highly specific, unavoidable trigger. The absolute moment my first legitimate child is born, a seismic shift in our financial architecture is legally mandated to occur." Nolan looked directly into my eyes, ensuring I understood the gravity of every single word. "It is not merely a symbolic title, Avery. When our baby is born, a massive portion of the trust's total voting power, the exact leverage that dictates the control of our investment funds, the board seats, and the coastal real estate empire automatically transfers away from the current generation. It is stripped from the hands of my parents, my aunts, and my siblings, and it drops directly into an ironclad, protected custody account that I will solely manage on behalf of our child." The kitchen went entirely still. The sound of the crashing waves outside faded into a dull hum as the horrifying truth recalibrated my entire universe. My pregnancy was no longer just a beautiful, personal miracle. To me, it was a tiny heartbeat on a black and white monitor, but to Vivian, Charles, Lenora, and Greer, it was an incoming hostile takeover. My unborn child was an existential, billion-dollar threat to their unchecked power, a living, breathing mechanism designed to systematically strip them of their financial supremacy. The suffocating anxiety morphed into something cold, hard, and entirely devastating. I finally understood the rules of the board. I was no longer an unwanted bride fighting for a scrap of acceptance at the dinner table. I was the lone, vulnerable obstacle standing between a syndicate of ruthless billionaires and their endless fountain of wealth, and they had just proven they would burn me alive to protect it. The sun had barely broken over the gray Atlantic horizon before our secluded coastal refuge was completely transformed from a quiet sanctuary into a high-tech tactical command center. Nolan did not waste a single second wallowing in grief or shock. Instead, he mobilized his vast resources with terrifying efficiency. He bypassed the family's traditional legal retainers, knowing full well that any firm tied to the Whitmore corporate umbrella was fundamentally compromised. Instead, he flew in an independent digital forensics team from Boston and retained a ruthless former federal prosecutor turned forensic attorney. Within 4 hours, the heavy oak dining table was completely covered with tangled black wires, humming servers, and multiple high-definition monitors displaying dense streams of encrypted data. The investigators immediately seized the physical folder Nolan had confiscated from the ballroom floor and began to meticulously dissect the weaponized lies. The first illusion to shatter was the photographic evidence. A senior digital analyst ran the scandalous images of Dean and me through proprietary error-level analysis software. The results were glaring and instantaneous. The pictures were not genuine photographs captured in a hotel lobby or a clinic parking lot. They were highly sophisticated, pixel-perfect composite images. The analyst isolated the specific source material, pulling up a series of candid shots taken at a charitable marine conservatory fundraiser I had attended with Nolan nearly 8 months ago. Whoever constructed the forgery had meticulously scraped my face and posture from the public event gallery, digitally adjusted the ambient lighting, and seamlessly grafted me onto a stock image of Dean. It was a masterclass in deepfake manipulation, designed exclusively to withstand a fleeting glance from a panicked, judgmental crowd. But the medical files were an entirely different, infinitely more sinister monster. The forensic attorney carefully examined the printed schedules and ultrasound scans under a harsh halogen lamp, his expression growing incredibly grim. These were not cheap counterfeits printed on standard copy paper. They were authentic, proprietary documents generated directly by the internal medical software suite used exclusively by the Harborline Women's Center. The paper stock, the watermark, and the encrypted barcode at the bottom margin were all completely genuine. However, the data fields within the authentic template had been surgically altered. The timeline of conception had been manually shifted backward by exactly 3 weeks to perfectly align with Dean's fabricated narrative of an affair. This chilling discovery elevated the attack from a pathetic social smear campaign to a severe federal cybercrime. It meant the architect of this plot possessed either administrative backdoor access to a highly secured healthcare network, or they had successfully bribed a human asset operating inside the clinic's administrative infrastructure. As the attorney explained the catastrophic legal implications of a corporate data breach, a sudden, cold memory pierced through the chaotic fog in my mind. I remembered my very first intake appointment at Harborline. I recalled walking up to the sleek, frosted glass reception desk and waiting for the receptionist to finish typing on her keyboard. Before I had even opened my mouth to state my name or hand over my identification card, she had looked up, her eyes widening slightly in immediate recognition. She had stammered, quickly offering me a clipboard with a nervous, overly familiar smile. At the time, I had naively assumed she simply recognized Nolan from local business magazines. Now, the memory tasted like ash. She had not recognized my husband. She had recognized her target. She had been paid to memorize my face and flag my electronic chart the second my name entered the system. While the tech team worked to decrypt the metadata on the clinic files, the forensic accountants launched a brutal, relentless hunt for Dean Talbot. The man himself had vanished into thin air the second he was escorted out of the estate's service doors. His temporary phone instantly deactivated. But as Nolan coldly pointed out, people can disappear, but money always leaves a distinct, indelible trail. It took the financial analysts less than 12 hours to isolate a massive, highly suspicious wire transfer. An offshore account had routed a payment of $75,000 into a newly established, obscure checking account registered under Dean's legal name. The origin of the funds was heavily obfuscated, buried beneath a labyrinth of dummy corporations and blind trusts. But the investigators possessed tools far beyond standard banking protocols. They painstakingly traced the digital ledger backwards, slicing through the corporate shell game until they hit a solid, undeniable firewall. The shell company that issued the payment was a defunct management consulting firm quietly maintained on the secondary ledgers of Whitmore Meridian Capital, and the sole individual possessing the executive clearance required to authorize unrecorded disbursements from that specific shadow account was Martin Sloan, the long-standing chief financial officer of the Whitmore family empire. The revelation hung heavy in the salty air of the living room, Martin Sloan was not just an employee, he was an absolute fixture at the family dinner table, a man who had known Nolan since childhood. The conspiracy was incredibly vast, heavily funded, and operating at the absolute highest echelons of the family's trusted inner circle. Refusing to remain a passive victim in my own life, I retreated to the small guest bedroom, flipped open my personal laptop, and decided to conduct my own parallel investigation. I navigated to a deeply buried, secondary email account I rarely used anymore, an address I had established back in my early 20s. If they had compromised my medical portals, they likely tried to infiltrate my digital life from every possible angle. I accessed the security dashboard and pulled up the raw login activity logs for the past 90 days. My breath caught in my throat. The screen displayed a terrifyingly long list of denied access attempts. Someone had tried to breach my inbox multiple times, employing brute force password cracking software. But the truly horrifying detail was not the method. It was the origin. I cross-referenced the primary IP address listed on the failed login reports with a public registry database. The geographic ping did not originate from a random hacker collective in a distant country. The digital assault had been launched directly from the highly secure, privately managed wireless network originating from the Whitmore family mansion in Newport. And the first attempted breach occurred exactly 5 weeks ago, long before the anniversary party was even finalized. I had been sitting in the same house, eating at the same table, with the exact person actively trying to destroy my life. But the final, devastating blow did not come from a financial ledger or an email server. It arrived late in the afternoon, just as the gray skies outside began to unleash a torrential coastal downpour. Marcus, the head of the estate security who had remained fiercely loyal to Nolan, managed to quietly smuggle a heavily encrypted hard drive out of the mansion. It contained the raw, unedited security footage Nolan had demanded during the ballroom lockdown. The lead investigator plugged the drive into the primary monitor and began scrubbing through the timestamps. He bypassed the grand entrance cameras, focusing instead on the hidden secondary lenses monitoring the chaotic catering corridors and the underground staff parking garage. The investigator slowed the playback to half speed, the grainy black and white video illuminating the screen. The timestamp read exactly 40 minutes before the anniversary gala was scheduled to begin. A sleek, unmarked black sedan pulled into the loading bay. The passenger door opened, and Dean Talbot stepped out, wearing the exact same cheap, ill-fitting suit he would later wear to humiliate me. He did not look lost or intimidated. He stood casually near the concrete pillar, completely ignoring the frantic chefs and florists rushing past him. He was waiting. 2 minutes later, a figure emerged from the heavy steel service doors connecting the kitchens to the main residence. The camera angle was steep, catching only the top of their head and their shoulders, but the distinctive posture and the custom-tailored evening wear were instantly recognizable. The insider approached Dean, handed him a thick manila envelope, gave him a set of rapid, highly animated instructions, and then personally swiped a master keycard to unlock the restricted interior stairwell, granting the hired actor unfettered, invisible access to the heart of the mansion. The investigator paused the video, freezing the frame on the unmistakable profile of the person holding the door. The room descended into a profound, suffocating silence. The humming of the servers and the violent crashing of the rain against the window panes seemed to fade into absolute nothingness. I slowly turned my head to look at Nolan. He was standing perfectly still, his tall frame rigid, his eyes locked dead on the frozen monitor. He did not speak. He did not yell or smash his fist against the table. But as I watched his profile, illuminated by the harsh, artificial light of the screen, I witnessed something entirely heartbreaking. The fierce, impenetrable armor he had worn since the moment the grand doors burst open finally cracked. A deep, silent fracture formed in his dark eyes, a devastating realization washing over him, stealing the warm color from his face. The architect of my public execution, the person who had meticulously plotted to destroy his marriage and delegitimize his unborn child, was not a rogue executive or an anonymous corporate rival. The enemy had a key to his childhood home. The enemy shared his last name. The enemy was his own blood. I refused to sit in the drafty guest room and wait for the men in the house to solve the destruction of my life. While the forensic experts remained glued to their encrypted monitors in the dining area, chasing down digital ghosts and offshore routing numbers, I claimed the small kitchen island as my own territory. The era of quietly weeping into a cashmere throw blanket was officially over. I opened a fresh, yellow legal pad and began the meticulous work of reclaiming my reality. For 3 hours, I systematically charted out every single day of the past 4 months. I drew rigid columns and cross-referenced every prenatal appointment, every supposed coincidental run-in with my hostile in-laws, and every mundane email I had received. I was a project analyst by trade, trained to spot the structural weaknesses in massive city planning grids. Now, I was applying that exact same ruthless logic to the timeline of my own body. I was mapping the exact trajectory of my surveillance. The highly paid lawyers in the next room were focused on the grand, dramatic elements of the crime, the forged photographs and the hired actor. But I knew that large conspiracies always crumbled at the mundane, administrative edges. I picked up my mobile phone and placed a secure call to a former colleague back in Providence, a senior data architect named Julian, who owed me a significant professional favor from our early days at Crestmere Urban Systems. I did not give him the scandalous context. I simply gave him my primary health insurance policy number and asked him to run a quiet, deep-level trace on the routing metadata of my recent medical claims. Julian called me back less than 2 hours later, his voice tight with professional concern. The breach he found was devastatingly simple, a stark reminder that the most dangerous threats rarely come from the outside. The infiltration of my medical privacy did not originate from a sophisticated, dark web attack on the clinic servers. The intrusion flowed directly through the polished, corporate front door of the Whitmore family enterprise. When I married into the dynasty, I was automatically enrolled in the ultra-premium, executive tier of the family's self-funded healthcare plan. Julian discovered that the billing codes for my routine blood panels and ultrasound scans were being routed directly through the primary human resources and benefits portal, managed by Whitmore Meridian Capital. Someone possessing elite, top-tier administrative privileges within the corporate financial suite had quietly established a mirror alert on my dependent profile. They had legally weaponized my status as a Whitmore wife to track the exact developmental milestones of my pregnancy. Armed with this undeniable proof, I carried my yellow notepad into the living room, marching straight toward where my husband stood staring out at the violent, gray ocean. I did not approach him softly. I did not ask for comfort. I demanded the unvarnished, numerical truth. I told him the vague explanations about generational shifts were no longer sufficient. I needed the exact mechanics, the hard math of the trust fund trigger that had turned my unborn baby into a corporate target. He turned away from the frosted window, his expression hardening into the icy, calculating boardroom persona I rarely witnessed at home. He laid the reality out with absolute, ruthless precision. The exact moment our child was born and a legitimate certificate of live birth was registered, an automatic, irrevocable transfer would be initiated within the core family trust. 18% of the total voting power governing the entire Whitmore empire would be immediately stripped from the collective holdings of his parents, his aunts, and his siblings. That massive block of influence would drop directly into a newly formed guardianship trust, and until our child reached the age of 25, my husband would possess sole uncontested proxy over every single one of those votes. The motive crystallized instantly, sharp and lethal. This elaborate psychological torture was never just about a snobbish, aristocratic disdain for my working-class roots. Aunt Lenora, my sister-in-law Greer, and the chief financial officer Martin Sloan were currently engineering a massive, highly controversial corporate merger. It was a shadowy, aggressive deal designed to quietly liquidate a stable sector of the family portfolio, a move that would personally enrich their own offshore accounts by tens of millions of dollars while effectively weakening the long-term foundation of the company. If my husband suddenly acquired that additional 18% voting block upon the birth of our baby, he would possess the exact mathematical leverage required to veto the entire merger and kill their massive payout instantly. The staggering weight of the truth settled over my shoulders, but instead of crushing me, it forged a rod of solid steel right down my spine. I was not a fragile victim of a petty socialite vendetta. I had been targeted by a ruthless corporate syndicate because the tiny heartbeat inside me was a billion-dollar roadblock. They did not merely hate me, they were terrified of me. Nolan began pacing the length of the worn rug, his jaw locked tight. He was entirely ready to authorize his legal team to march into the corporate headquarters, drop the raw security footage on the mahogany boardroom table, and burn his treacherous relatives to the ground that very afternoon. I reached out and caught his arm, stopping his momentum entirely. I looked him dead in the eye and firmly told him no. I proposed a counter-strategy that required a completely different, much colder kind of nerve. If his family was desperate enough to forge medical data, manipulate insurance portals, and hire a theatrical con artist to ruin an anniversary gala, they were operating on a highly pressured, ticking clock. If we struck them right now with our incomplete hand, they would simply use their immense wealth and legal army to dismiss the actor as a rogue extortionist. They would burn the chief financial officer as a scapegoat and completely bury the internal data breach under mountains of non-disclosure agreements. We needed them to feel victorious. We needed them to believe their cruel trap had worked flawlessly, forcing them to confidently take the final, irreversible steps to secure their fraudulent merger in the broad daylight of the public market. I told my husband that we had to absorb the blow, retreat into the shadows, and let his family get aggressively, fatally sloppy. For the first time since we had exchanged our vows, the dynamic between us shifted fundamentally. The heavy, protective instinct he always harbored toward me, the constant need to shield me from the venomous politics of his lineage, entirely fell away. It was replaced by a profound, calculating respect. He did not look down at me as a fragile, pregnant wife who needed to be rescued. He looked at me as a brilliant, equal partner. He saw a true strategic ally in a war we were now entirely, ruthlessly committed to winning together. Nolan left for the corporate headquarters in Boston on Monday morning. We had meticulously scripted this phase of our counterattack. He was to walk into the lion's den entirely alone, projecting the exhausted, defeated aura of a man who was quietly considering a highly discreet, bloodless resolution to his marital scandal. It was a brilliant, necessary deception, but the reality of his physical absence was a suffocating weight. My phone would occasionally buzz with painfully brief text messages. He would type that he was buried in closed-door meetings, that he needed a few days to end things properly with the board. Logically, I knew the phrase "end things" referred to the trap we were setting for his treasonous relatives. Emotionally, the sudden, glacial shift in his tone plunged a jagged shard of ice directly into my chest. The surging hormones of my first trimester amplified every single insecurity I had ever harbored. Sitting alone in the silent, drafty beach house, I found myself staring at his sterile messages, terrified that the heavy, intoxicating gravity of his billionaire lineage was finally pulling him back into their orbit, leaving me entirely adrift. On Tuesday afternoon, the agonizing silence was violently punctured by a phone call. It was not my husband, it was my sister-in-law, Greer. Her voice dripped with a sickening, manufactured syrup of synthetic pity. She bypassed any polite greeting, launching straight into a performance of deep, sisterly concern. She claimed she wanted to save me from a brutal, drawn-out public slaughter in the divorce courts. She offered to meet me privately, away from the vicious eyes of the family lawyers, to help me secure a graceful exit. I agreed, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, knowing exactly what she was attempting to do. We met at a secluded, heavily draped tea room inside a historic downtown hotel. I wore a simple, structured trench coat, keeping my hands buried deep in my pockets where my fingers tightly gripped a small, activated digital voice recorder. Greer arrived wrapped in excessive cashmere, looking entirely too thrilled for a woman supposedly mourning the collapse of her brother's marriage. She ordered a pot of expensive tea and wasted absolutely no time. Reaching into her designer handbag, she slid a thick, professionally bound legal document across the polished mahogany table. It was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement combined with a total, irrevocable waiver of all financial and custodial rights. It explicitly demanded that I renounce any future claims on the Whitmore estate on behalf of my unborn child. I stared down at the crisp white pages, a cold, triumphant clarity washing over my lingering anxieties. This physical document was the golden bullet. The legal clauses were incredibly dense, requiring weeks of careful drafting by top-tier estate attorneys. There was absolutely no physical way this elaborate contract could have been drawn up in the frantic 48 hours since the anniversary gala. They had prepared this legal guillotine long before Dean ever kicked open the ballroom doors. It was undeniable, physical proof of premeditation. Greer leaned across the table, her eyes glittering with predatory eagerness. She urged me to sign it right then and there. She promised a generous, immediate wire transfer to a private account of my choosing, enough money to guarantee a comfortable, quiet life far away from Newport. When I feigned hesitation, acting the part of a terrified, broken woman, her mask of pity slipped entirely. "Do not be stupid, Avery," Greer snapped, her voice dropping into a harsh, venomous hiss. "You have absolutely zero leverage left. You are publicly ruined. Why drag this out and force Nolan to destroy you in court? Just take the money and disappear." Dean was nothing but a cheap actor hired to do some dirty work, but the press does not know that, and they never will. The public already despises you. Sign the paper and walk away with your dignity intact. The tiny device hidden in my pocket captured every single syllable of her arrogant, fatal admission. I kept my face perfectly blank, sliding the unexecuted contract into my bag, telling her I needed a single night to consult a cheap local attorney before signing my life away. She scoffed, calling me a pathetic fool, but she let me walk out of the tea room, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just handed me the heavy rope required to hang her entire faction. While I was securing a taped confession from his sister, Nolan was executing the second phase of our snare in Boston. He deliberately isolated Martin Sloan in the executive suites, pouring the chief financial officer a glass of rare scotch and playing the part of the utterly humiliated, exhausted heir. Nolan subtly indicated that he was prepared to sweep the entire scandalous ordeal under the rug, quietly divorcing me to protect the corporate merger, provided there were no further embarrassing media leaks. Feeling profoundly secure and deeply arrogant in his supposed victory, Martin fell perfectly into the trap. Believing Nolan was too broken to audit the shadow accounts, Martin authorized one final, massive wire transfer to ensure Dean's permanent silence, routing the hush money through a secondary, easily traceable intermediary shell company. Our independent forensic accountants intercepted the digital receipt the moment the funds moved. We had them trapped on all sides. Yet, the intricate web of deception we were weaving began to violently blur the lines of my own reality. On Wednesday evening, I drove into the city to secretly rendezvous with Nolan at a neutral, secure location, a private, underground parking garage beneath a luxury high-rise where he maintained a discreet corporate suite. I parked my rental car in the deep shadows and walked toward his designated elevator bank, my chest tight with a desperate need to see his face, to feel his arms around me and validate that we were still fighting on the exact same side. As I rounded the thick concrete pillar, the heavy metal doors of the private elevator slid open with a soft chime. I froze, stepping quickly back into the impenetrable darkness. Nolan stepped out into the dim fluorescent light of the garage, but he was not alone. Vivian Whitmore walked entirely in step beside him. My mother-in-law looked exceptionally pale, her usual imperious posture slightly rigid, her hands tightly clasping a small leather clutch. They stopped mere feet from where I stood hidden, their voices low and muffled by the cavernous acoustics of the concrete structure. I could not decipher the exact words they were exchanging, but the body language was intensely private, completely devoid of the explosive hostility I expected from an interrogation. Vivian reached out, placing a tentative, gloved hand on Nolan's forearm. He did not pull away. He looked down at her, his handsome face frozen in a mask of absolute, impenetrable ice. It was a look I had never seen directed at me, but more terrifyingly, it was a look that gave absolutely nothing away. It was the face of a master negotiator closing a high-stakes, ruthless deal behind closed doors. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, before turning and walking toward his waiting car, leaving his mother standing alone in the quiet garage. My breath caught in my throat, a fresh, sickening wave of absolute terror crashing over me. We had explicitly agreed to trap Martin and Greer, but Vivian had never been part of our strategic discussion. Had Nolan just aggressively cornered the matriarch into a total, devastating confession, or had the crushing, undeniable weight of his bloodline finally fractured our fragile alliance? Standing entirely alone in the cold, echoing darkness, staring at the red taillights of my husband's car disappearing into the night, I was suddenly, horrifyingly unsure if he was preparing to burn his entire empire to the ground to save me, or if he had just finalized the ultimate terms of my surrender. When Nolan finally returned to the beach house late that Wednesday night, I did not wait for him to remove his overcoat. I stood in the center of the dimly lit living room, my arms crossed tightly against my chest, and demanded an immediate explanation for what I had witnessed in the underground parking garage. The lingering terror of betrayal was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth, but I forced my voice to remain perfectly level. I needed to know, right then and there, if I was still his partner in this war, or if he was secretly negotiating the terms of my surrender with the matriarch of his empire. Nolan stopped dead in his tracks. The heavy exhaustion momentarily lifted from his sharp features, instantly replaced by a fierce, startling clarity. He crossed the hardwood floor in 3 long strides, taking my face in his cold hands. He swore to me, his voice trembling with a rare, raw intensity, that he had not compromised our position for a single second. He explained that the secret meeting with Vivian was a calculated, psychological stress test. He had deliberately fed his mother the lie that he was broken and ready to submit to the family's wishes, waiting to see if she would finally crack under the immense moral weight of what they had done to his unborn child, or if she would eagerly accept his defeat. She had chosen the latter, sealing her own fate. "We cannot simply hand your recorded tape and the digital bank statements over to the local authorities tomorrow morning," Nolan stated, dropping his hands and pacing the length of the room, his tone ringing with a cold, lethal logic. "If we strike them now, behind closed doors, we only wound the beast. They possess enough capital and political leverage to amputate the infected limbs and survive. They will instantly fire Martin Sloan, issue a carefully worded press release claiming the chief financial officer embezzled the funds on a rogue mission, and send my sister to a luxury psychiatric facility in the Swiss Alps for exhaustion. They will sacrifice the hired actor, bury the scandal, and walk away with the corporate merger entirely intact." He turned to face me, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "We need them to fully commit," he continued. "We need them to stand under the brightest lights, declare absolute victory, and legally bind themselves to this fraudulent merger. We need them to build their own gallows and confidently step up to the rope. And the perfect place for that execution is Friday night." Friday night was the Whitmore Meridian Capital Board meeting, followed immediately by a lavish, highly publicized gala announcing the massive corporate merger. Every major financial player, political ally, and voting member of the family trust would be gathered in one magnificent, gilded room in Newport to spring the ultimate trap. We needed the final piece of the puzzle to break. Earlier that same afternoon, our independent digital investigators had cornered Dean Talbot in a cheap, roadside motel on the outskirts of Boston. They did not threaten him with physical violence. They simply laid a mountain of undeniable federal evidence on the stained mattress. They showed him the offshore bank routing numbers, his exact cellular location data perfectly matching the mansion's coordinates on the night of our anniversary, and played the crystal-clear audio recording of Greer casually referring to him as a disposable, cheap actor hired to do some dirty work. The investigators informed Dean that the Whitmore family was currently laying the groundwork to frame him for criminal extortion, a desperate maneuver to cover their own massive corporate fraud. Dean had visibly panicked, the arrogant swagger completely evaporating as he realized he was being set up to take the fall for a billionaire syndicate. He was cracking, sweating profusely through his cheap shirt, but the paralyzing fear of the family's unlimited resources still kept his mouth tightly shut. He refused to sign a formal confession or agree to step into the public light just yet. Nolan was not worried. He knew the intense, suffocating pressure of an impending federal indictment would eventually force the man's hand. I agreed to walk back into the exact same high society fire that had nearly consumed me. I knew I would be stepping into a grand ballroom filled with hundreds of powerful people who firmly believed I was a disgraced, manipulative fraud. I knew I would face the mocking whispers and the cruel, judging stares. But the sickening dread that had paralyzed me during our anniversary party was completely gone. I was no longer walking into their territory to beg for their approval or plead for my innocence. I was walking in there to definitively end their game. While Nolan spent Thursday coordinating with his forensic attorneys, drafting an emergency legal injunction designed to instantly freeze the massive merger the exact second corporate fraud was established, I sat at the kitchen island and prepared my own weapon. I wrote a speech. I did not write a tearful, emotional defense of my fidelity or my character. I drafted a cold, surgical dissection of extreme wealth. I wanted to accurately detail exactly how an elite, powerful syndicate could view a pregnant woman not as a human being, but as a strategic obstacle to be neutralized. I refined every single sentence until the words were as sharp as a scalpel. Then, late Thursday afternoon, an unexpected twist fractured the battle plan. My encrypted phone chimed with a secure message from an unknown number. It was Vivian. She requested a highly private, face-to-face meeting at a quiet botanical garden halfway between the beach house and the city. She explicitly demanded that Nolan not be informed of this rendezvous. I drove there alone, keeping my right hand securely on the digital recorder hidden deep inside my trench coat pocket. Vivian was waiting on a secluded iron bench, entirely surrounded by blooming white orchids. She looked incredibly aged, the flawless, aristocratic mask showing deep, irreversible cracks around her eyes and mouth. When she spoke, she did not offer a single word of apology. There were no tears, no dramatic pleas for forgiveness. Instead, she offered a cold, calculated transaction of truth. "I did not build the guillotine, Avery," Vivian said, her voice dry and hollow, staring straight ahead at the condensation on the glass walls of the greenhouse. "I am entirely aware of what Lenora, Martin, and my daughter have done." Lenora was the architect. She realized the generational trust clause would destroy her lucrative merger, so she designed the narrative to ruin you. Martin funded the actor through the shadow accounts. Greer provided your internal clinic schedules and executed the physical floor plan. I stared at her, my blood running like ice water through my veins. "And what exactly was your role in the assassination of my child?" I asked, refusing to let her off the hook, demanding she speak her own sins aloud. Vivian finally turned her pale, icy eyes toward me. My role was silence. They came to me with the blueprint, and I simply chose to look the other way. I let it happen because I firmly believed Nolan would be better off without you in the long run. But seeing him in that garage yesterday, seeing the absolute, terrifying emptiness in his eyes when he looked at me, I realized they have miscalculated entirely. He is not going to quietly sign the divorce papers to protect the brand. He is preparing to tear the entire company apart to avenge you. She was trying to save herself. She was throwing her sister-in-law and her own daughter directly under the bus to secure amnesty from the incoming slaughter she knew her son was about to unleash. I left her sitting alone among the orchids and drove straight back to the coast. When I relayed the entire chilling conversation to Nolan, detailing his mother's complicity through silence, his jaw tightened into a rigid, unforgiving line. I asked him if we should use her private admission to force a quiet surrender from the board before the gala began. Nolan shook his head. his dark eyes burning with a fierce, uncompromising resolve. No, he commanded softly, the word ringing with absolute finality. A whispered confession in a greenhouse changes absolutely nothing. If we use her words now, they will just claim she is a hysterical, aging woman buckling under family stress, and they will discredit her entirely. It is not enough. He walked over, resting his warm hands heavily on my shoulders, grounding me in the reality of what we were about to do. I do not want private apologies. Avery, I want public accountability. I want every single piece of forged evidence, every illicit wire transfer, and every malicious lie dragged out into the glaring light of day. I want them to stand exactly where they feel the most powerful, right in the center of the empire they tried to protect. And I want them to realize they have lost everything. The trap was fully set, the legal injunctions were secretly filed, and the targets were blissfully unaware of the absolute destruction heading their way. We packed our bags, prepared our formal evening wear, and drove back toward the city. We were going to a party. The air inside the Newport Maritime Hall was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the electric hum of impending wealth. I stepped through the gilded archways wearing a high-necked midnight blue gown. It was entirely modest, devoid of the flashy, distracting diamonds the Whitmore women favored. I did not need armor made of jewels tonight. My armor was the man walking beside me. Nolan did not guide me by the elbow like a disgraced wife being marched to a public tribunal. He held my hand firmly, our fingers intertwined, his stride purposeful and commanding. He was leading me into a victory lap. The grand hall was packed with local politicians, elite investors, and every voting member of the Whitmore Family Trust. At the front of the room, an enormous mahogany table was set for the official signing of the corporate merger. Aunt Lenora stood at the podium, her posture radiating a smug, absolute triumph. She tapped the microphone, her voice echoing smoothly over the hushed crowd. She spoke endlessly about the sacred Whitmore legacy, the vital importance of financial stability, and the hard, necessary sacrifices required to protect the family name. Her eyes kept darting toward Nolan, a sickeningly proud glint in her gaze. She fully believed my husband had returned to the fold, completely broken, ready to sign the merger and publicly sever ties with me right in front of the local elite. As the senior corporate attorney stepped forward to distribute the final binding documents, Nolan released my hand. He walked calmly up the center aisle, bypassing the seating area entirely, and stepped directly onto the raised stage. He did not look at Lenora. He picked up the spare microphone. "Before anyone signs a single binding document tonight," Nolan announced, his voice slicing through the heavy anticipation like a steel blade, "I have an emergency internal compliance update that requires the immediate attention of this entire board." He gestured to the back of the room. The massive presentation screens, which were supposed to display the glorious financial projections of the merger, suddenly flickered black. A collective gasp ripped through the audience as the first slide illuminated the hall. It was a massive, high-definition projection of the offshore wire transfer. The numbers were undeniable. $75,000, routed directly from a Whitmore Meridian Capital Shadow account managed by Martin Sloan into the obscure checking account of Dean Talbot. Before the room could even process the financial anomaly, the screen shifted. Crystal-clear security footage played, showing Dean Talbot being escorted through the mansion's service entrance exactly 40 minutes before our anniversary gala. The person holding the door for him was unmistakably Greer. Then came the digital access logs, stark white text on a black background, proving that my highly confidential maternity files had been breached through the family's own health insurance portal. The final, devastating blow was the audio. The crisp, undeniable voice of Greer echoed through the silent, horrified hall. "Dean was nothing but a cheap actor hired to do some dirty work." Lenora's face turned the color of wet ash. Martin Sloan dropped his gold pen, the metallic clatter deafening in the dead quiet. Greer shrank back into her chair, her hands shaking violently. But the execution was not over. The heavy side doors of the auditorium swung open, and Dean Talbot walked in. He was no longer wearing the cheap suit or the arrogant smirk. He was flanked by two massive private investigators, looking pale and thoroughly terrified. He did not walk in as an accuser tonight. He walked in as the star witness for the prosecution. Given a microphone, Dean's voice trembled as he confessed everything to the room of billionaires. He explicitly named Lenora, Martin, and Greer. He detailed exactly how they had paid him to memorize the intimate details of my pregnancy, instructing him to crash the gala and delegitimize my unborn child before the 18% trust clause could be legally triggered by the birth. The audience erupted into chaotic, horrified whispers. The pristine, gold-plated facade of the Whitmore dynasty was completely disintegrating in real time. Suddenly, Vivian Whitmore scrambled up from the front row. Tears streamed down her perfectly contoured face, her voice cracking in a desperate, theatrical display of maternal anguish. She reached out toward the stage, pleading with Nolan to stop, begging him to handle this privately, crying that she was entirely heartbroken by the actions of her sister-in-law and daughter. Nolan looked down at his mother, his expression colder than the freezing Atlantic Ocean. He did not raise his voice, but his words carried a lethal, inescapable weight. "You are not the victim here, Mother," Nolan stated, completely silencing her tears. "You are not innocent simply because you were not the one who drafted the original blueprint. They came to you with this vile plan, and you had every opportunity to stop it. You chose to look the other way. You chose silence. And in this family, silence is absolute complicity." Vivian collapsed back into her chair, utterly destroyed by the public rejection. Nolan turned his attention back to the paralyzed board of directors. He pulled a thick, legally binding folder from his interior jacket pocket and dropped it onto the mahogany table with a heavy thud. "I am not just shutting down this fraudulent merger," Nolan declared, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying authority. "I have officially filed a federal injunction to freeze all current assets involved in this transaction. I am demanding the immediate termination of Martin Sloan as Chief Financial Officer and the permanent suspension of Lenora and Greer from their board seats, pending a full federal investigation." He paused, letting the sheer magnitude of the destruction sink in, before delivering the final, fatal strike. "Furthermore, I refuse to inherit an empire built on the blood of my own family. I am officially triggering the special severance clause within my grandfather's trust. Effective immediately, I am transferring 100% of my personal voting rights and unvested capital out of the Whitmore Meridian portfolio. It is being moved entirely into a newly established, fully independent entity called the Harper Legacy Trust, a fund that will be controlled exclusively by my wife, Avery, and held in protection for our child. You wanted to cut them out of the legacy. Instead, I am removing the legacy from you. As of this exact moment, I publicly resign as the heir to the Whitmore family." The shock in the room was absolute. It was a physical force, pinning every single guest to their seats. They had expected him to clean house and take the throne. Instead, he had burned the throne to the ground and handed the ashes to the woman they had tried to destroy. Nolan stepped back and looked at me. It was my turn. I walked slowly up the stairs, my head held high. I did not shed a single tear. I did not look at the crowd for sympathy. I looked directly down at Lenora, Greer, and Vivian. "You looked at my unborn child and saw nothing but a mathematical threat to your offshore accounts," I said, my voice steady, amplified for the entire elite circle to hear. "You tried to turn a baby into a disposable pawn in a pathetic game of corporate power, but you made one catastrophic miscalculation. You vastly underestimated the strength of a mother protecting her child, and you entirely underestimated the loyalty of the man standing beside me." There was no screaming. There was no dramatic begging from the Whitmore family. The sheer, overwhelming totality of their defeat left them completely paralyzed. Nolan reached up to the lapel of his tailored jacket. His fingers traced the heavy gold Whitmore family crest pin he had worn for the last decade. With a sharp, deliberate motion, he unclasped it, He did not toss it aggressively. He simply placed it on top of the frozen merger documents on the boardroom table. He walked down the steps, took my hand once more, and together, we turned our backs on the room. As we walked down the long center aisle toward the exit, the heavy oak doors burst open, and the flashes of a dozen press cameras illuminated the hallway, tipped off by the legal filings. We walked straight through the blinding lights, leaving the ruins of the dynasty behind us. In the deafening silence of the grand hall, the remaining Whitmores finally understood their absolute failure. They did not lose their golden son because of a working-class girl from Rhode Island. They lost him entirely because of their own venomous, corrupt nature. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to Violet Revenge Stories, like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.